Once upon a time, in the ancient Yoruba kingdom of Oyo, Abeni stood alone in the sacred forest of Osun. She was bound to the goddess from birth, chosen as a priestess for Osun, the goddess of love, fertility, and beauty. Her white garments, decorated with intricate beads, clung to her as symbols of devotion, each one a reminder of the vows she had sworn. Abeni knew her life belonged to the goddess. Her days were filled with rituals, chants, and unending service, each moment dictated by Osun's will. Yet, on quiet days in the forest, she found herself longing for something beyond her duty. She would gaze into the sacred river, where her own face stared back with an expression that felt foreign, an unfamiliar yearning that grew harder to silence. The forest around her was alive, breathing with an ancient power. Trees towered like silent witnesses, their leaves whispering secrets in the wind. Abeni closed her eyes, inhaling the rich, earthy scent that clung to the air. Here, in Osun's domain, she felt closest to the goddess. And yet, her heart beat with a desire she didn't dare speak. She wanted to live a life not bound by rites and prayers. She wanted to feel the freedom that only others seemed to know, but she remembered. She had seen the fate of those who defied their paths, cast out, forsaken by family and forgotten by the gods. Shadows of those memories kept her silent, her desires buried. "Focus, Abeni," she whispered, kneeling beside the river's edge, her fingers trailing through the cool, clear water. "The goddess is watching. You are her chosen one." Yet, as her fingers touched the water, a face, a man's face, appeared in her mind, unbidden. He was strong, with a warmth in his eyes that softened the stern lines of his face. The thought of him filled her with a quiet, unfamiliar thrill, but guilt quickly crept in. Love had no place in her heart, no room in the life she had pledged to Osun. Still, the image lingered, like a shadow cast on her heart, refusing to fade. The sunlight shifted, filtering through the canopy above, casting a mosaic of gold and green on the ground. This forest, so full of life and beauty, was her sanctuary, but today it felt different. The trees seemed to lean in, as if they knew her secrets. The river, usually calm and still, sparkled with an unnatural brightness, almost as if inviting her closer to its mysteries. Then, amidst the silence, she felt it, a presence lingering at the forest's edge. Her heart quickened, an instinctive response to something unseen yet deeply felt. She didn't know who or what awaited her, but an unexplainable pull kept her rooted in place. Little did she know, this moment would be the beginning of a love that would defy the gods and shake the very foundation of her world. As the sun slipped below the horizon, its golden light bathed Oyo in a final, fiery glow, casting tendrils of shadow across the land. Abeni stepped to the edge of the sacred forest, where the trees leaned in, whispering secrets from ages past. At the riverbank, she saw him. Adebayo, tall and commanding, stood among the reeds like a figure from a story, his form outlined against the dusky light. He wore the rich, textured azo-oke of a warrior, the fabric a testament to his lineage, yet his eyes held a quiet sorrow that softened his fierce stance. There was power in the way he stood, yet a gentleness as his gaze met hers. She felt it instantly, a subtle catch in her breath, as if the forest itself had taken pause. Their eyes held, and in that suspended moment, Abeni felt the weight of the river's cool air pressing on her skin, the earthy scent of the forest sharp in her lungs. A pulse beat between them, slow and deliberate, like the steady drum of the earth itself. She was suddenly aware of every sound around them, the quiet murmur of water, the rustling of leaves, the faint thrum of her own heartbeat. Adebayo's gaze lingered on her, his expression shifting with something she couldn't name. She saw his lips part, as if he might speak, then close, a moment of hesitation she'd never imagined in a warrior like him. His hand clenched briefly at his side, as if restraining himself from crossing an invisible line drawn between them. She could sense the strength he possessed, the fierce protector revered across the kingdom, yet in his steady, searching eyes she felt an ache that mirrored her own, a sorrow softened by yearning. Abeni, bound by her vows to Osun, stood rooted in place, her heart pounding in defiance of her duty. Her life, sworn to serve the goddess, had never allowed for such feelings, yet here was a man whose mere presence drew her closer to a world she'd only dared to dream of. Forbidden thoughts surfaced, the thrill of possibility mixed with the fear of what such desires could bring. The trees around her seemed to murmur warnings, as if the forest itself knew the dangers of her wavering devotion. The air between them grew charged, a palpable energy that neither could deny. She was a priestess, bound to the goddess, and he, a warrior with a heart that had known too much sorrow. Still, something greater than both their roles seemed to pull them together, bridging the unspoken barriers between their lives. The shadows deepened as they stood across from one another, their unbreakable connection unfolding like the river before them, timeless, unyielding, and forbidden. In that fleeting moment, Abeni understood. Her soul had found its counterpart, and neither her vows nor his duty could change that truth. Their fates, once separate, were now woven together, a quiet but undeniable promise held in the depths of their gaze. He stepped closer, his voice respectful yet filled with something deeper. "Priestess, it is said that Osun's favor shines brightly upon you," he said, his voice low and sincere. She merely nodded, unsure of how to respond. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, before he turned to leave, his presence still echoing in the air long after he was gone. But the seed had been planted. Abeni's heart fluttered with an unfamiliar feeling, one that she quickly pushed away. She was Osun's, and there could be no place for love in her life. Yet the connection had been made, and she knew it would not be so easily forgotten. The days that followed were a blur of ritual and routine, but Abeni could not shake the memory of that encounter. Every time she ventured near the river or the forest, she felt Adebayo's presence in the air, as if he were a shadow trailing just out of sight. It was not that she sought him, no, her duty to Osun was clear. But there were moments when she would find herself wondering what life would be like if she were not tied to the goddess's calling, and as the weeks passed, their paths crossed more frequently. What began as mere glances quickly grew into lingering moments, each one more charged than the last. One evening, under the shade of an ancient tree, the air was thick with the scent of earth and the rustle of leaves. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow on the ground. Abeni stood still, her hands lightly pressed against the trunk of the tree, her gaze lost in thought. She had come here many times before to seek solace, but today something felt different. The wind carried a subtle charge, as if the very air between her and the world had shifted. Adebayo approached quietly, his footsteps soft on the earth. He had been watching her for a while, as he often did when he found himself near the sacred forest. There was something about her presence that drew him in, a quiet strength that seemed to call to him, even though they had not exchanged many words. "Priestess," he said gently, his voice breaking the silence between them. "Do you find peace here?" Abeni turned to face him, her heart beating a little faster than usual. There was something about this moment, with him standing so close, that made her uneasy. "The river," she began, her voice steady but her heart fluttering, "speaks the language of Osun. It brings peace to my spirit." She looked down at her hands, unwilling to meet his gaze just yet. Adebayo stepped a little closer, his expression thoughtful. "And what does the river tell you today?" he asked, his voice softer now, as though he were trying to understand something deeper than the words she spoke. Abeni's heart skipped a beat. Why did his question seem so personal? She quickly gathered herself, her eyes meeting his for the briefest of moments. "The river tells me that peace comes only through sacrifice," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with an underlying sadness. Adebayo's gaze softened, his brow furrowing slightly as he studied her. "Sacrifice," he echoed quietly. There was a weight in the word, and he seemed to understand more than he let on. For a long moment, neither spoke. Abeni could feel the tension building between them, but she refused to acknowledge it because she was Osun's, bound by vows and ancient duties. Her heart had no room for distractions. Finally, Adebayo broke the silence again, his voice sincere but edged with something unspoken. It must be hard, he said, almost hesitantly, to carry such a heavy responsibility, to give so much of yourself, and yet, to never ask for anything in return. Abeni looked at him then, really looked at him, and in his eyes she saw something that stirred a deep, unfamiliar feeling. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something that made her heart ache, something that made her question everything she had believed about duty and sacrifice. I don't ask for anything, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. It is my purpose. I am chosen. She could feel the pull of her calling, but at the same time, there was a part of her that longed for more. But she quickly pushed that feeling away, the weight of her duty suffocating any desires of her own. I admire your strength, Abeni, he said, his voice low, but there was something else in it now, a hint of something personal, something deeper than admiration alone. I can see that your devotion to Osun runs deeper than anything I could understand. Abeni's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she wasn't sure how to respond. I must go, she said suddenly, breaking the spell between them. The goddess calls me. Adebayo nodded, his expression unreadable, but his eyes lingered on her a moment longer. I understand, he said softly. But know this, Abeni. If you ever need someone to listen, to share your burdens with, I am here. The words were simple, but there was a depth to them that made Abeni pause. He didn't ask for anything in return, he only offered understanding. And for a moment, she wished she could say something, anything, to acknowledge the quiet connection between them. But instead she simply nodded and turned, walking away, her heart heavy with unspoken thoughts. As she made her way back to the sacred river, she couldn't help but wonder. What if her heart could belong to something more than duty? What if, for just a moment, she could forget the goddess's calling and live for herself? But the answer was clear. She couldn't. Not yet. And so, she would bury these thoughts, these feelings, deep within herself where they could do no harm. Since their chance meeting on the riverbank, Abeni made every effort to keep her distance from Adebayo. Yet, fate seemed intent on bringing them together. Their paths crossed time and again, sometimes by the village paths, other times near the forest's edge. Each meeting carried a sense of quiet inevitability, but it was no longer the raw intensity of their first encounter. Abeni had learned to keep her composure around him, her heart guarded but her curiosity growing. They exchanged pleasantries at first, small polite words about the village and the weather. Adebayo would offer a smile, genuine and warm, but respectful of the distance Abeni maintained. She was surprised by how easily their words flowed, how they could laugh at simple things, and how, despite everything, they felt comfortable around each other. As the days passed slowly, Abeni found herself anticipating their encounters more and more. It was not that her feelings had changed drastically, but the absence of discomfort when Adebayo was around began to transform into something more, something subtle, yet undeniable. She began to look forward to their brief conversations. His laughter, light and unguarded, began to feel like a breath of fresh air. Adebayo continued to accompany her during her walks, never pressing too close but always nearby. Abeni had grown used to his presence, and in a strange way she found it reassuring. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the trees, casting golden light through the forest canopy, they sat under the shade of an ancient baobab tree, as they often did. You know, Adebayo said softly, his voice carrying the weight of memories, I wasn't always this calm. When I was younger, I was full of fire. I wanted to prove myself in every battle, even the ones that didn't matter. Abeni turned to look at him, her curiosity piqued. She had always seen him as a warrior, confident and composed. To hear him speak of a time when he had struggled with his own emotions was a revelation. And now? She asked quietly. Now I've learned that true strength isn't in the fights we win, he said, his gaze distant, but in the battles we learn to walk away from. Abeni watched him closely, noting the slight sadness that lingered in his eyes. It was a softness she hadn't expected to find in a warrior like him. She understood that look more than she let on. She too had fought battles that left scars not visible to others. "I think I understand," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Some of the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves." Adebayo met her gaze, his eyes filled with an understanding that seemed to transcend the years between them. The air between them grew thick with an emotion neither of them had fully acknowledged, but both of them felt. The words were there, hovering on the edge of her tongue, but she could not bring herself to say them. Instead, they sat in silence, their shared understanding blooming like a flower. It became harder to ignore the pull between them. Every time their paths crossed, it was like the air grew heavier, charged with an unspoken desire. Abeni found herself thinking of him more than she wanted to admit, wondering what it would feel like to let go, to give in to the longing that had taken root inside her. One evening, as the sun began to set, they met again near the forest's edge. Abeni was gathering herbs, but as she looked up, she saw him standing there, silent, his eyes burning through the distance between them. "Abeni!" Adebayo's voice broke the stillness, soft yet thick with an emotion she couldn't quite name. His words seemed to hover in the air, hanging heavy with a longing that matched the sudden racing of her pulse. Slowly he took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Will you walk with me?" Abeni's breath caught, a flutter of anticipation rising in her chest. There had been countless moments shared near him, many days passed in silence and unspoken words. But tonight felt different. The space between them had shifted, charged, alive. Her pulse quickened as she nodded, unable to trust her voice, afraid it would betray the feelings she hadn't yet accepted. They walked, and though the path before them stretched wide and open, the distance between them felt impossibly small. The tension coiled like a delicate thread, a pull she could not resist. Abeni could feel the heat of his body with every step, each movement in unison, as if they were attuned to each other without words. "Abeni," he said her name again, and this time it was laden with something more. She felt it, a weight in her chest. "Adebayo," she whispered, the words tumbling out, unbidden. The tremble in her voice betrayed her. She wanted to pull back, to retreat to the safety of distance, but his gaze, the intensity of it, held her captive. He closed the gap between them, and the air thickened with the weight of unspoken words. His hand brushed against hers, the touch so light it sent a jolt of heat through her, as though something had sparked between them. She froze, her heart pounding louder than her thoughts, and their hands hovered, teetering, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, his breath coming faster. The world seemed to still around them. Abeni's gaze flickered to his lips, and for a heartbeat, they were both caught in the space between, neither moving, both uncertain. Then slowly, deliberately, Adebayo's fingers grazed hers again. The touch, soft but purposeful, seemed to crack the air between them. Abeni's breath caught as the heat of his touch flooded her senses. She didn't want him to pull away, not now, not when she could almost feel the answers to all the questions that had been building in her chest. "You're different, Abeni," he said, his voice low and fragile, like a secret shared only between them. "When I'm near you, everything else fades. It's as if nothing else matters." Her heart fluttered painfully, but the words caught in her throat. She wanted to speak, to respond, but her thoughts scattered. She felt something, a pull stronger than anything she'd ever known. She wanted to pull away, but instead, she stepped closer, drawn in by the electric pull between them. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she stood there, caught between duty and desire, her body unwilling to move. Adebayo reached for her hand then, his touch steady, a promise. His fingers intertwined with hers, the warmth of him flooding through her skin, sending a wave of heat crashing over her. Abeni's pulse raced, her chest tightening with the weight of the moment, but she didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled into his, grounding herself in the simple connection, even as 1,000 questions swirled inside her. They stood there, in silence, not moving, but everything between them shifting. Abeni's gaze flickered to his lips again, her heart pounding as she wondered if he too felt the weight of this moment, this pull. But as her breath quickened, the weight of her vows returned, the promises, the duties she had sworn to uphold. She pulled her gaze away, overwhelmed. "I can't," she whispered, the words barely audible but crushing all the same. "I'm not like you, Adebayo. I can't let myself want this." His grip tightened, firm but gentle, as if he could hold her together. "You don't have to choose, Abeni," he said softly, his words like a balm. "I'm not asking you to give up anything. I just want you to know. I care about you. More than I ever thought I could." Abeni closed her eyes, her heart aching as his touch lingered on her skin. She wanted to feel it, wanted to let herself give in, but the weight of her vows was too great, too consuming. She had never been allowed to want for herself. She had always been the healer, the one who gave, who sacrificed. But Adebayo, he was different. And as much as she fought it, she couldn't deny the way he made her feel. Eventually, the love between Abeni and Adebayo flourished in secret, their stolen moments filled with longing and passion. Yet, as with all forbidden things, their love could not remain concealed forever. The world had a way of revealing what was hidden, especially when jealousy festered like a wound. Akin, Adebayo's younger brother, had always struggled in his brother's shadow. While Adebayo was revered by all for his strength and honor, Akin's efforts went unnoticed. The more Adebayo was celebrated, the deeper Akin's bitterness grew. It was as if his brother had everything: respect, admiration, even the gods' favor, while Akin was left with nothing but the envy that gnawed at him. When Akin saw how Adebayo had been slipping away at odd times, disappearing into the night with no explanation, the jealousy in his chest grew sharp. He began to suspect that his brother, who was always so disciplined, might be hiding something. Akin didn't know what it was, but his hatred for Adebayo's perfect life, and the feeling that he was always overlooked, pushed him to follow his brother one evening. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Akin quietly trailed behind Adebayo. He kept his distance, his heart pounding with both curiosity and resentment. Why was Adebayo sneaking around as if he were some common thief? Akin's jealousy burned hot, and he needed to know what was going on. After a while, Akin's patience paid off. He watched as Adebayo made his way through the trees, and then in the clearing ahead, he saw it. Adebayo and Abeni, standing too close, their voices a soft murmur that stirred something dark within him. Akin's eyes narrowed as he watched them. The tender way Adebayo looked at Abeni, the way her gaze softened in return, it was all too much. His brother, the great warrior, the man everyone admired, was in love with a woman who could never be his. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. His brother, whom he had always resented for taking everything that should have been his, had been keeping a secret. Adebayo, the one who could do no wrong in the eyes of the village, was now breaking the sacred bond of the gods, and Akin would be damned before he let it go unnoticed. His jealousy surged, clouding his judgment. Akin turned and stormed toward the elders, his heart racing with a twisted sense of satisfaction. He had the power to destroy it all, his brother's perfect life, the love that had no place in their world. When Akin's words reached the elders, the weight of them was immediately felt. The council, sworn to uphold the gods' will, acted quickly. Abeni, bound to the gods, and Adebayo, respected by all, had broken the sacred law. The punishment for such a crime was severe, and Akin knew that with his words he had set in motion a chain of events that would destroy their world. As the news spread, whispers filled the village. The air was thick with tension as everyone waited to see what would happen. Akin felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. For years, he had been in his brother's shadow, unnoticed and ignored. But now, with this one act, Akin had the power to bring everything Adebayo had built crashing down. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was the end of his brother's happiness, and Akin was the one who would make it happen. The village held its breath, waiting for the storm to come, as Abeni and Adebayo's fates were sealed by a brother's jealousy. Adebayo was the first to hear. The sun had barely risen when the messenger arrived, his face grim and his footsteps hurried. "Adebayo," he called out in a low voice, as if afraid the words themselves might be too loud. "The elders have summoned you, and Abeni, you must come immediately." Adebayo's heart sank. The gravity of the messenger's tone was enough to tell him that this was no ordinary summons. He felt a cold sweat prickling at the back of his neck. Something had gone wrong, very wrong. He ran to find Abeni, his steps swift and heavy with dread. When he found her, standing in the quiet shade of the tree where they had shared their most precious moments, he saw the worry in her eyes even before he spoke. "Abeni," he said, his voice low but urgent. "The elders have called for us. We must go." Abeni's face went pale, and her heart fluttered in her chest. She had feared this moment ever since the first day her love for Adebayo had blossomed, knew it was only a matter of time before someone found out. "What do they want with us?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. "I don't know," Adebayo replied, his brow furrowed. "But we can't ignore this. We have to face them." Word of the summons spread quickly through the village, and by the time Abeni and Adebayo arrived at the council chamber, the weight of the village's gaze was unbearable. Whispers followed them like shadows, their love now a thing of gossip and scorn. The council chamber was dimly lit by flickering oil lamps, the shadows of the elders stretching long and ominous. Their presence was imposing, and their faces, partially hidden beneath intricately decorated caps and flowing agbadas, were a testament to the weight of the tradition they upheld. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, each word spoken by the elders resonating with the cold authority of generations. "Abeni," the chief elder's voice cracked the silence, his words heavy with disdain. "You, who were chosen by the goddess Osun herself, sworn to a life of purity and devotion, how could you betray the very vows you took? You have defiled the sacred bond between gods and mortals." Tears welled up in Abeni's eyes, her hands trembling at her sides. She had never imagined this moment would come, yet here she stood, her love for Adebayo exposed, her sacred vows shattered before the very people she had once served. "Elder, I love him," she said softly, her voice breaking under the weight of her confession. "I never meant to defy Osun, but my heart does not know these boundaries." Adebayo, standing beside her, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a mix of fury and sorrow, spoke up, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I too am bound by duty and honor, but my heart beats only for her. Let the gods judge me, but I will not deny what I feel." The elders exchanged solemn looks, their faces unreadable. Their decision came swiftly, and their words cut through the room like a blade. They would be separated, and a curse would follow them, a curse that would bind their spirits together in torment for all eternity. The only way to lift the curse would be for one of them to make the ultimate sacrifice. Abeni and Adebayo would never find peace unless their love was severed, forever cursed to wander the earth, unable to be together in life or death. The days following the elder's curse were heavy with grief and uncertainty. Abeni spent hours by the sacred river, where she had once found peace in Adebayo's presence. But now, the water's reflection seemed distant, the moonlight no longer comforting. The weight of the curse settled deep within her bones, its chill unbearable. She knew what she had to do. The moon rose high on the night before her sacrifice, casting a silver glow across the land. Abeni stood alone on the cliff's edge, overlooking the sacred forest where the earth seemed to meet the sky. Here, the veil between the human world and the divine was said to be thinnest, and it was here she would give herself to Osun, offering her life to break the curse that bound her and Adebayo apart. Adebayo, unable to stay away any longer, arrived quietly, his face drawn with sorrow. Seeing her standing there, so determined, filled him with both admiration and heartache. His heart ached, a hollow feeling that only deepened when their eyes met. "Abeni," he said softly, his voice hoarse with emotion, "please don't do this. I can't lose you. I can't. Not like this. His words broke her. She turned toward him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, and for a moment they both stood still, as though the world had paused just for them. She could see the pain in his eyes, the love that would never fade, but there was no escape. The elders had spoken. The gods had demanded it. There was no other way. I love you, Adebayo, she whispered, her voice trembling. And I can't bear the thought of your soul being tortured forever. This is the only way for you to be free. She stepped closer to him, her hands trembling as she cupped his face. If I offer myself to Osun, our spirits will be at peace. And you will be free to live. Adebayo's chest tightened as he reached out, holding her hands in his. I don't care about the gods, Abeni. I only care about you. His voice broke. I don't want to live in a world without you. Tears streamed down her face as she pressed her forehead against his. They stood there in silence, surrounded by the rustling of the wind and the distant sounds of the sacred forest. The finality of the moment pressed down on them like an immovable weight. Adebayo's hands slid to her waist, pulling her gently against him, his heart racing in a desperate attempt to feel her warmth just a little longer. Then, in a moment that seemed to stretch the very fabric of time, Abeni reached up and kissed him. It was a kiss of everything they had shared, every moment, every longing, every tear. It was a kiss that spoke the words neither of them had dared to say aloud. I love you, and I always will. Their lips met softly at first, tentative, as if both were unsure if this would be the last time they could truly be together. But then, the kiss deepened as their hearts poured into the embrace. The world around them seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them. Two souls bound together by love, despite the forces that sought to tear them apart. It was a kiss of longing, of sorrow, of acceptance. In that single moment, they shared everything they could not say, everything they had kept hidden behind the veil of duty and tradition. When they finally pulled away, both were breathless, their foreheads resting against one another. You will always be my heart, Abeni, Adebayo whispered, his voice breaking. She smiled through her tears, her hands tracing the lines of his face one final time. And you, mine. With a final, lingering glance, Abeni turned away. Adebayo followed her to the edge of the cliff, his heart in turmoil, knowing this would be the last time he could look upon her. He watched helplessly as she knelt, her hands raised to the heavens, offering herself to Osun, the goddess she had always served. As the first light of dawn kissed the earth, a soft glow enveloped Abeni's form, her spirit rising from her body like a shimmer of light in the morning air. Adebayo fell to his knees, a gut-wrenching cry escaping him as he watched the woman he loved slip away from him forever. The sky seemed to darken, as though the world itself mourned her sacrifice. The winds howled as Abeni's spirit ascended, and in that moment, Adebayo knew that while she had left this world, her love would never fade. She had given everything for him, and in his heart, she would live forever. The years passed, but the memory of Abeni and Adebayo lived on. The people of Oyo still speak of the cursed lovers, their story passed down through generations. It is said that every new moon, when the river shines with a silvery glow, the spirits of Abeni and Adebayo reunite for one final moment of love. For Adebayo, the loss never faded. He rose to greater heights as a warrior, but inside, he was forever changed. He never married, never sought another love. He knew that his heart was bound to Abeni's spirit, and nothing, not even time, could sever that bond. And so, their love, forbidden and tragic, became a legend. A tale of sacrifice, of love so pure that even the gods could not contain it.